Noticing and having missing conversations can change your life and the life of those around you. It can change you. It is changing me. I've been lucky enough to teach innovation for 15 years, and I define it as acting on ideas for a purpose. The purpose is important. It doesn't have to be global. It doesn't have to be huge, but it does need to matter. Missing conversations are a great tool to start what I call a practice of individual innovation, a tool to help you develop conversations about things that really matter. I suggest starting close to home with conversations to build relationships with neighbors, with coworkers, and with family. And even closer to home, to think about your thinking and how it's serving your purpose. I hope today you'll start your own practice of individual innovation by thinking about and having your missing conversations. What are your missing conversations? Well, they might be conversations that are absolutely missing. They're the ones that we're not having right now. They also might be subconscious conversations. And because they're subconscious, we don't notice them. Let's start by exploring the first kind, conversations that are literally missing. It's July 15th, 2016. You're in my car, we're driving to work, and I hit dial and call my sister Vicky in England. She says hi, and she's accompanied by a cacophony of barking from her beloved dogs. I greet the dogs, and the barking dies down. Vicky advises that she's having a bad day today. So I listen to her, and I remind her that I love her. And she feels a little better. In fact, we both feel better. Let's leave that story there and come back to it in a moment. First, some context. Vicky and I grew up, had a fabulous relationship as young children. And as we got a little older, our lives diverged. My coming to university at America literally put an ocean between us. Her life held a lot of tragedy. She lost 2 husbands and both her sons to different causes and at different times. She suffered loneliness and grief. And in 2006, I thought to myself, I'd like to recreate that relationship with my sister that I had as a child. I also want to be there for her during this difficult time. So I made myself a promise. I'll call Vicky every 2 weeks. 4 years later, I was reviewing this promise with my innovation class, and to my horror, I noticed that I wasn't keeping it. I was failing in my own class. Or was I? Isn't innovation all about trying and failing and learning? Noticing the failure sparked a new idea. Could I possibly call Vicky every workday? This new idea, while it seemed a lot harder than the original idea, was actually easier, and I managed to keep it. And Vicky and I talked for the next 6 years every workday until sadly she died in 2016. Let's review this through the lens of individual innovation and missing conversations. There was a missing conversation for 4 years. I was not talking to my sister every 2 weeks. That idea sparked a new idea that I could potentially act on. I acted on that idea, and it changed everything for the 2 of us. We were able to reconnect, make a fantastic relationship that we'd had as children, and there were other wonderful outcomes as well. Vicky was able to reconnect with her daughter-in-law, Shelley, and Shelley's lovely family by having her own missing conversations to make that happen. And at the celebration of Vicky's life, 2 of Shelley's very young children gave beautiful eulogies about how Vicky had attended their sports and their practices. And one of them even said, unlike Uncle James, Vicky never fell asleep in my gymnastics practice. Conversations about death may be the ultimate missing conversation. At our church, we run a class, a grief class, called Walking the Mourner's Path. And we ask all the participants, how is death discussed in your family of origin? And 100% of the time, it's never. The answer is it's never discussed. And that certainly was my experience. How about you? One thing you can do for people who are grieving is just be there and listen, as you're doing now. Death is hard to talk about, and perhaps that's why it's so often a missing conversation. But courage can really help. Courage to face the fear of opening old wounds. Courage to face the fear of sharing sensitive personal information. It's hard. So choose well and ask, what conversations will you have? With whom? About what? And why? The second type of missing conversation are subconscious conversations. And you may find these a little surprising. They're actually conversations you're having with yourself. How can you possibly miss conversations you're having with yourself? Turns out it's pretty easy. Because they're subconscious, you don't notice them. These are assessments, prejudgments, and yes, prejudices. And to be clear, prejudice is not always a bad thing. In fact, every time you cross the road, your prejudgment saves your life. You get to the road and you prejudge, is it safe to cross? Another example of subconscious conversations is assuming that we all speak the same language. So Winston Churchill famously said that America and England are two nations divided by a common language. And having spent the first 20 years of my life learning English, and the next 40 years, actually a little bit more of my life, learning American English, I'm constantly amazed by the number of differences I notice between our two common languages. Here's a story to tell the point. 40 years ago, my American wife and I lived in England, and she just joined a very serious all-female lawyer's office. And on her first day to work, she noticed everybody was wearing dresses. So she stepped into her boss's office and asked, would it be okay if I wore pants to work today? To which her astonished boss said, Mrs. Barnes, I hope you'll wear pants to work today. I mean tomorrow. Tomorrow. All right, there wasn't today. All right, so what Buff didn't know was that in England, pants mean underpants. She had just asked her boss if she could wear underpants to work. A third example of subconscious conversations involves two short stories and a little audience participation. So please listen well and think about your thinking. Here comes the first story. Sarah is a good student, but let's stop right there. What are you thinking? Nice participation. I suspect you're probably thinking of some stories about Sarah. Let's try that again. Here comes the second story. Sarah is a good student, and now what are you thinking? Okay, so did your Sarah Ann stories, were they different from the Sarah Butt? And they were. Isn't that interesting that you're changing one word makes such a big difference in a conversation? And probably the most important point here is not the but and the and, but the fact that you had that thought in your mind. And a big question is, did you notice that thought until I asked you about it? Cognitive scientists suggest that we create meaning in what we're hearing by relating to our own lived experience. So as we hear a story or we hear words, we're already anticipating what the meaning of those words are, and sometimes we're finishing the story before the storyteller has finished, like you did with Sarah. I often wonder about what cognitive scientists think, and I wonder if that's true. If we create meaning out of our own stories, it's a disaster. It's almost no wonder that the world is so confused and there's so much tension in the world, not to mention languages. It's the interpretation. In fact, I often think that everybody thinks the same way I think. How crazy is that? You know, perhaps I'm the only person that thinks the way I think. Perhaps I'm the only person that speaks my language. And perhaps, to build on what Sir Winston Churchill said, we're a globe of 8 billion people divided by 8 billion languages. One thing you can do about this is to stop and ask, what are my prejudices, and are they serving my purpose? So to summarize, there are two types of conversation: those that are actually not happening, and subconscious conversations. Examples of those that are actually not happening are like conversations with Vicky that were not happening. Also conversations about death. And conversations that are subconscious, the examples there were thinking about two languages, the stories that you made up. So let's summarize for a moment and think about what it is that a missing conversation is to you. Let's return to the story, You're in My Car, which just called my sister Vicky. 2 days after that event, there was a message on my phone. Vicky had left a message. It would be the last that she would ever leave. And in it, she described that she'd had a great trip to the Stained Glass Museum. She had a very good meeting with her psychiatrist. And she ended the story by saying, I love you all. Bye. And it's that joy in that bye that encourages me to encourage you to start your individual innovation practice. Notice your missing conversations and have the ones that are literally missing that are important. And notice your prejudgments and prejudices and challenge those prejudices, change them. But first notice them, because until you notice them, you have no hope of changing them. Vicky and I used to love having bonfires. We would sit around the bonfire with our family and just have wonderful times. And a couple of years before she died, we would do this quite a lot with our brother. Now I often will have a bonfire in the backyard, and I'll sit by it, and I'll just sit and remember the joy that Vicky brought to the world. So here we are, by the fireside, remembering Vicky. What are your missing conversations? I hope you'll be inspired to start an individual innovation practice, noticing and having your missing conversations. You'll be glad if you do. It will change you, as it continues to change me, one conversation at a time. Thank you.